Welcome to EPG Pathshala. In this particular module, we will be discussing a play by the American playwright Tennessee Williams. I am Niladri Chatterjee, Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani in West Bengal. Tennessee Williams is one of the most important playwrights of 20th century American literature. He is best known for several plays, and A Streetcar Named Desire is perhaps his best known plays. But there are other plays such as The Glass Menagerie, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, The Rose Tattoo, Camino Real. There are several plays like this, but today we will be talking about Streetcar Named Desire. What we will be doing in this module is I'm going to give you a very brief overview of his life. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of his writings and exactly what he has achieved. And there is going to be a discussion about the play, the various elements in the play, which will involve the plot summary, the characters, the kind of language that is used, symbols, motifs, and thematic devices and literary and dramatic devices. Before I go on to discuss the play, let us talk a little bit about the life of Tennessee Williams. He was born on 26th of March, 1911 in Columbus, Mississippi. He was the second child of Cornelius Williams and Edwina Williams. He was both physically and mentally affected by illness and his father's excessive alcoholism during his early childhood days. Due to mainly the constant shifting of the family and familial problems, his educational journey was not that smooth. He first joined University of Missouri in 1929 but was forced to quit. Then he joined University of Washington in 1935 but was again compelled to quit due to personal problems. Later, he joined the University of Iowa with much hardship and he finally graduated from there in 1939. But the most important event to happen in Tennessee Williams' life was that in 1940 he joined an advanced playwriting class at the New School in New York City. And this was a very important part of his life because that is when he received training on how to write a play. But his writing actually began from his childhood days. He was writing when he was very young. He, for example, wrote a short story called The Field of Blue Children in the Story magazine in 1939. He also published a horror story in the Strand magazine. He went on to write more than 25 plays, many one-act plays, short stories, and also 2 novels. With the publication of The Glass Menagerie in 1944, he established himself as a prominent writer and went on to write many more important plays like A Streetcar Named Desire, which we will be discussing right now, Summer and Smoke, The Rose Tattoo, The Camino Real, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Orpheus Descending, an early version of Something Unspoken, Suddenly Last Summer, and Sweet Bird of Youth. His first notable play was The Glass Menagerie. This won him the prestigious New York Critics Circle Award. Many people have actually regarded the play as being autobiographical, and it is vaguely based on his life, and much of it is actually modeled on the rather troubled life of his sister. His 2 other plays, A Streetcar Named Desire, 1947, and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, 1955, also won the New York Critics Circle Award and also the Pulitzer Prize. It's true that towards the end of his career, he lost his reputation as an excellent playwright, but even today, he is remembered as an important figure in the realm of American literature. What are the basic elements of his writing? His style of writing has several characteristics. On the one hand, it is rather realistic. Now, what do I mean by this? By realistic, I mean that the characters that he creates, the language that the characters speak, they are drawn almost readily from real life. So when you are watching a play by Tennessee Williams, you feel as though the action is actually happening right in front of you. You do not even think that this is a play that you're watching because his dialogue is so incredibly lifelike. He had a real gift for dialogue, and that is something which he constantly uses in various plays. But sometimes his plays can also be rather lyrical. What do I mean by that? What is a lyric? A lyric is basically a kind of poetry, longish, but it can be short too, but mostly long, in which one particular idea is developed through the entire poem. So therefore there is no narrative, it is just the development of an idea. And this is something that we find in many of Tennessee Williams' plays, in which there is one central idea that is developed through the entire play. So you can say that the plays are not particularly revered because of the plot, because the plot in Tennessee Williams's plays is not important. It is not important as to what happens, who does what to whom. What is much more important is what is the theme, what is the basic point that Tennessee Williams is trying to make. There is, of course, a certain poetic diction. By which I mean that even in Tennessee Williams' use of language, although when he's using language he wants to keep it as realistic as possible, but he somehow manages to create a certain poetic beauty even when the language that he uses is coarse. So it all depends upon the way in which he actually challenges the language, in the sense that the language can be at the same time realistic as well as poetic. And this is something that he manages to do rather well. Something that we find repeatedly in all of his plays is a certain Freudian approach. What do I mean by that? By Freudian approach, I mean that many of his themes or many of his characters are actually inspired by the writings of Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst, in the sense that he is much more interested in the psychology of the characters. He is much more interested in finding out what the characters do and why they do it. He is also fascinated by the notion of madness, for example. He is fascinated by the notion of obsession, of preoccupation. So all of these come into his plays in a rather remarkable way. And of course, towards the end of his career, he also was writing in a rather expressionistic form, by which I mean that here his plays were perhaps not terribly realistic, but they were actually developing a kind of idea, so which makes the plays lyrical. Exactly what is the history behind A Streetcar Named Desire? Well, apparently, assuming that he was going to die within a few days, Tennessee Williams wanted to tell about the unfulfilled desires of life and the approach of death as the sad but ultimate reality through this play. And now we move on to a detailed analysis of the various characters in the play. And perhaps the most important character in the play, the female lead as it were, is Blanche Du Bois. As you can see, the surname Du Bois is actually originally a French surname. So the correct way to pronounce it would be to say Du Bois. So that would actually lead you to understand that this particular family is of French origin. They were originally from France and then they settled over here. Also, please pay attention to the name Blanche. Now, Blanche, of course, is the American pronunciation, but if you look at the French pronunciation, it is actually Blanche. Blanche in French is female for white. So therefore, Blanche Du Bois's name means white, and Du Bois, of course, means from the woods. So when we look at from the woods, the idea from the woods, that clearly means that there is a kind of, there's supposed to be almost an expectation of innocence. And white, as we very well know, is the color of purity. It is the color of innocence. So look at the way in which Tennessee Williams has very carefully chosen the name Blanche Du Bois or Blanche Du Bois, because through this character, he is almost trying to give the impression that what you are called need not necessarily be the same as what you are in real life. So Blanche Du Bois, she is a school teacher in Laurel, Mississippi. After losing all her family assets and job, she arrives at New Orleans to live with her sister and brother-in-law. She is unable to come out of her sense of class superiority and always mocks the working class lifestyle of her brother-in-law. This subjects her to the hatred of her brother-in-law. She drinks heavily, hiding it from her sister and brother-in-law, and also to forget her miserable past, and prefers to live in the world of imagination. Stella Kowalski. Stella is the younger sister of Blanche, and as you know very well, they live in New Orleans and she lives with her husband. She has adapted herself well to the working class environment in which her husband lives. She has also almost forgotten her well-to-do background, and she appears to be quite happy. She appears to be quite reconciled with this working class life that she has got into. But her moderate language and sober nature clearly implies that she does not belong to the working class community by birth. So when you are looking at the characters of Stella, and when you're looking at the character of Blanche, please remember that these two women represent a certain upper class sophistication. And this upper class sophistication is going to contrast with the lack of sophistication that we find in Stanley Kowalski, which of course brings me to the husband of Stella, Stanley. Stanley appears to be very loyal and honest to his wife in the beginning. He works as an auto parts supplier. He is very strong. He is very muscular. And this, coupled with his working class background, gives Stanley a very sort of aggressive demeanor, a very aggressive character. And this is also reflected in his tone. So when you look at the character of Stanley, you are therefore going to look at somebody who is clearly a manual laborer, in the sense that his body is built in such a way that you know that he has built it up purely through manual labor. He's working class, he's very aggressive, his language is unsophisticated, he does not care very much for grammatical correctness. So it is interesting the way in which his character is developed, because through the development of Stanley Kowalski's character, Tennessee Williams is basically giving us an idea as to what a working class man would look like, what a working class man would sound like. The other thing that I would perhaps want to mention over here is that Stanley Kowalski has got enormous sexual charisma. He's sexually very attractive. And I think this may have something to do with the fact that Tennessee Williams, who himself was homosexual, was perhaps trying to create this male character who is sexually very attractive but is also very, very destructive. So therefore, in Stanley Kowalski, we have the representation of a character who is both attractive and destructive in the same way. He does not like the class pretension at all, and that is why he starts hating Blanche from the very beginning. Towards the end of the play, we can observe a degeneration in his character because he beats his wife, and of course there is the instance where Stanley actually rapes Blanche. We come to Harold Mitchell. Now, Harold Mitchell, he is a friend of Stanley's. Though he too belongs to the working class community, but Harold is very interesting in the sense that he is not quite as aggressive as Stanley is. He's very gentle. He falls in love with Blanche and can be seen comforting her in hard times. He knows that in terms of language and manners, he can never match Blanche, but he tries his best and wants to marry her. But he ultimately leaves her when he comes to know about her scandalous past and tries to have sex with her. Towards the end of the play, during Blanche's final departure to an asylum, he becomes remorseful. It shows his inherent gentleness. So we are looking at two rather contrasting characters here. We have got Mitch on the one hand, you've got Stanley on the other. Mitch is working class, Stanley is working class too. But the difference between them is that Mitch is perhaps a very gentle person. He does not believe in aggression. He does not believe in using ungrammatical language. He really wants to be regarded as somebody who is very gentle, somebody who is very caring. And this is something which puts him as a contrast, as it were, to the character of Stanley. There are other minor characters as well. There is, for example, Eunice and Steve. Eunice and Steve are husband and wife. They are neighbors to Stella and Stanley, and they live just upstairs. Eunice is very close to Stella and is seen comforting her or advising her a few times. On the other hand, Steve is a friend of Stanley's and a regular to the poker games often organized at Stanley's place. We also have the character of Shaw. Shaw works with Stanley and is Stanley's interests, he works as an informer to find and collect facts about Blanche's past. There are some minor characters as well, and I'm just going to very quickly go through the minor characters. There is Shep Huntley, who is a former suitor of Blanche and a millionaire. There is Alan Gray, who is the dead husband of Blanche. There is a doctor and a nurse. There is a collector, an African-American woman, and a prostitute. But these are all minor characters, and now we can move on to the greater understanding of the play. What exactly happens in the play? There isn't much to talk about the plot. Blanche arrives in New Orleans to live with Stella and Stanley. Because of her class pretensions, Stanley starts to hate her. This hatred keeps growing because of Blanche's arrogance. She starts loving Mitch, a friend of Stanley, without having any better option of her choice. Stanley ultimately comes to know about Blanche's promiscuous nature and informs Stella and Mitch about it. After hearing this, Mitch refuses to marry, though he previously wished to do so. Mitch tries to have sex with Blanche, but she refuses. Stanley, while having a heated argument with Blanche, forcefully rapes her. Stella does not believe Blanche's allegation that basically when Blanche says that she has indeed been raped, Stella does not believe her sister. Blanche suffers a nervous breakdown and starts to talk incoherently. A doctor and a nurse appear and take her to an asylum. Mitch starts crying out of remorse. Stella too is seen crying. At the end, Stanley is seen comforting Stella, which hints at their happy future. That is really the way in which the play ends. But of course, there is more to it than that, and we shall go to a further analysis of the play. Perhaps the most important thing about the play, or one of the most important things certainly, is the use of language. There is a clear difference between the way in which Blanche and Stella use language and the way in which Stanley and his friends use language. Look at the language that Blanche is using. It is polished, it is sophisticated, it is grammatically correct. Look at the language that Stanley is using. It is coarse, it is non-grammatical. So these two types of language perfectly bring to the fore the true nature and class distinction that exists between Stanley, Stanley's friend, and Blanche, and indeed Stella. So therefore, something that Tennessee Williams is clearly trying to tell us is that how we speak is very often an indication as to the class that we come from. And that is something that Tennessee Williams very carefully constructs through the entire play. So, what would you say are the themes of the play? One, certainly, is the triumph of reality. I'm not going to call it a triumph, perhaps, but I'll certainly talk about the reinforcement of reality, because what the play proves is that no matter how much you fantasize about your life, ultimately, reality is going to catch up with you. Reality ultimately overpowers or subverts everything that you imagine. Blanche's failed attempt to forget and undermine her miserable past and indeed her present, they both convey this theme rather perfectly. The other theme of the play, which is something that I've already been talking about, but I think I need to emphasize that even more, is the class conflict. There seems to be a clear binarization in the play about working class and upper class. Stanley, working class; Stella, upper class; Blanche, upper class. So therefore, Mitch, again, working class. So therefore, there are several ways in which this kind of antagonism between the two classes is consistently invoked by Tennessee Williams in his play. Something else that I think we should keep in mind is the decline of the aristocratic class of the American South. And this has been represented, of course, through the character of Blanche, because please keep in mind that Blanche may belong to the upper class, but she has no money. She has no money, and therefore she has her upper class pretensions, she has her upper class sophistication, but she doesn't have the money, which is why she's forced to live with the working class couple of Stanley and Stella. Stella, of course, isn't working class to begin with, but she has adapted herself. So look at the way in which Blanche is actually compromising. She's compromising on her social status because of the simple reason that the aristocracy of the American South has actually waned. You can also read the play as perhaps Tennessee Williams's critique or protest, perhaps, against the way in which women are seen to be consistently dependent upon men, even when those men are not very well behaved. And when we learn about this, we also therefore try and connect with the fact that Southern America or Southern United States is perhaps and always will be a little bit more patriarchal than the East. So therefore, there is greater racism, there are greater class divisions, and so therefore there is a greater amount of patriarchy in the American South. And in this play, we clearly have an example of that. What are the motifs and what are the symbols in the play? Bathing and drunkenness are invoked repeatedly. Blanche has the habit of frequently bathing herself. Now, what does this mean? Does this therefore hint at the fact that she is trying to wash away her past? Is her taking a bath her effort to say that I am going to clean my life of my past history? But clearly she does not succeed in doing that. Also, her heavy drinking hints at the fact that she is unwilling to come out from the imaginary world. So therefore, for Blanche, drinking, or rather alcohol, becomes a refuge. She hides behind the drinking because when she drinks, she is able to forget her miserable present, and she can therefore imagine that everything is wonderful and everything is well with her life. There is a rather interesting use of light in the play, because as Blanche always tries to avoid light on her face, it is almost as though if the light shines on her face, then her reality would be exposed. There are, of course, some other interesting elements in the play, and I would certainly want to refer to the deployment of music. How exactly does the music work, and how do the sounds work in the play? And also, how do the shadows work? The use of shadows of irregular sizes symbolizes Blanche's departure into the world of insanity, because towards the end that is what happens. And the use of the Varsovian polka music at various points of the play symbolizes the remorseful mental state of Blanche, but she is remorseful, but she is also fighting. Meat. There is the instance of Stanley throwing a blood-stained packet of meat at his wife and asking her to catch it, subtly symbolizes the highly masculine and rather aggressive and rather violent nature of Stanley. So Tennessee Williams clearly uses various kinds of indications, hints, suggestions, motifs, symbols to gradually build up these characters in his play. There are certain dramatic devices that are used. The sound of the screeching cat, for example, at Blanche's arrival at the apartment hints at her unstable mind and her inattentions. The background music is also continuously there, hinting at the unbearable loneliness and sorrows of Blanche, and the shadows of irregular sizes, of course, that I have referred to earlier. So these are some of the dramatic devices that he uses in the play. There are certain literary devices as well. Foreshadowing is one. Now, what is foreshadowing? Foreshadowing is a mainly literary device. What does it do? It basically says that something is going to happen in the future. So before something that happens in the future, there is a certain hint that is given to it. So it is the hint that we refer to as foreshadowing. Say, for example, Blanche uses two streetcars. Now, streetcars in our Indian English, we could perhaps talk of them as trams. So he uses these two trams, namely Desire and Cemeteries. Now, that is odd that the trams should be named named like that. But I think you have to keep in mind that there is a very interesting comment in the naming of those two trams at the very beginning. So therefore it means that unfulfilled desires and approaching death, these are the two very important aspects of Blanche's life and Blanche's character. There is also a scene involving a prostitute and the prostitute's encounter with a customer. This is also meant to prepare us for the rape of Blanche that is going to happen later on in the play. What I really want to therefore talk about is the way in which we are going to look at the various symbols, the various devices, the various methods that Tennessee Williams uses to bring this particular story to light. What exactly are the elements that we are going to take away from this play? Clearly, there is a certain comment that Tennessee Williams is making regarding the violent nature of an aggressive working class masculinity. And the fact that Tennessee Williams is actually making a comment on masculinity is very, very important, because if you keep in mind something that has been discussed before in a previous module, that 1950s is a time when these gender stereotypes are again reinforced. So men are expected to be manly, women are expected to be womanly. So therefore, Stanley, in a rather troubling way, seems to symbolize a kind of aggressive, ill-behaved, uncouth, almost like a primal masculinity. And that is something which Stanley constantly performs in the course of the play. If you're interested, you can certainly check out a rather wonderful film that was made on this play, in which the role of Stanley is played by Marlon Brando. And the choice of Marlon Brando is also rather significant, because through his sheer physical presence, he manages to bring the character of Stanley to life in the way in which very few people have done before. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is the class factor. What is it that Tennessee Williams is trying to say? Is he trying to say that the impoverished aristocratic class have to accept their reality? They have to accept the fact that times have changed and they cannot afford to keep up their aristocratic pretensions anymore. What is Tennessee Williams saying about the way in which Stella has managed to adapt herself? So is Stella, therefore, what Tennessee Williams is upholding as the ideal way in which you adapt because of your changed circumstances? And if you cannot adapt, then does that mean that you are bound to go mad? Does it mean that your inability to adjust to changed circumstances gradually leads to insanity? This is a very violent play. This is a very dark play. This is a play which is not meant to be for light entertainment, because it actually asks certain very basic, very troubling questions about what happens to people when their life changes profoundly. I would therefore come to the conclusion that once you read the play, you must be aware of the various troubling questions that Tennessee Williams is raising. And once you become aware of these questions, and once you know that the answer to those questions, or at least suggestions to the answer to those questions, are spread all across the play, I think you are going to enjoy the play as a text. Thank you.